Racism in Florida. Recently, many of the murders that we've seen in Florida are racially motivated. The perpetrators always being white and the victims being random, leaving many people who are African American, Asian, and Hispanic in Florida living in fear of a random act of violence. In Jacksonville, Florida, we saw a white man randomly walk into a Dollar General and target random victims. In Ocala, Florida, we saw an elderly white woman shoot through a door, killing a mother in front of her children over what seemed like something completely insignificant. Arrest photo mugshot shows a completely unrepentant face. And law enforcement only making an arrest for this murder after the community made a massive outcry. Had it been a black person, they would have been arrested on the spot. But because she was white, law enforcement wanted to make sure there wasn't any misunderstandings. And the truth is that even law enforcement is puzzled and confused in how the white population, which usually was rarely involved in murders, is now at the forefront of most of the murders coming out of Florida. Whether random acts of violence in parking lots, road rage shootings, or just outright racist attacks on random victims, whites in Florida have become the foremost news articles that we are seeing coming out of the state when it comes to random gun violence. What has changed in Florida, and why are whites in Florida now becoming more violent than ever? As white random gun violence becomes more common, people are even afraid of road rage shootings, random acts of violence targeting anyone. Many times, that anyone is also racially motivated. Most of the time, crimes like murders do not cross racial boundaries, with blacks committing most of the black murders. It goes the same for most other races. However, in the state of Florida, we've recently seen an uptick in white random gun violence targeting other races, and it's left a lot of people in the state living in fear. So what is the cause of this problem? Why are whites in Florida becoming more violent than ever? A little research shows that the state of Florida is in the middle of a drug crisis, and these drugs make people feel overly emotional and violent, has emboldened people to think that their racist views are actually appropriate, with Florida's governor Ron DeSantis being booed for showing up at the Jacksonville Memorial for the victims there, being that the perpetrator of that crime had Nazi symbols on his gun that he used to commit the murders, the same symbols that are commonly seen at Ron DeSantis' rallies. With racism having a stronger political power than ever, we're seeing the return of George Wallace-era politicians. Catering to people's racism and hate through politics has led a lot of people to believe that these acts of violence against random people serve a greater political motive. How bad is Florida's white drug addiction? Compared to other races, whites in Florida are about 2 times more likely to die from an overdose. And people in the state of Florida are 1.4 times more likely to die from an overdose than people in states like California. Yet despite the state of Florida having some of the worst overdose rates in the entire country, politicians in Florida point a finger at California and say they're the ones with a problem. Not only is Florida not fixing the problem, they're not even trying to admit that a problem exists. The homeless population in Florida is being underrepresented statistically to Florida Health. Take the case of Manatee County, Florida, which claims to only have 185 homeless people. After extensively researching the homeless population in Manatee County, most people would agree that we're looking at about 10 times that number in Manatee County. So the state of Florida and its municipalities and counties are doing everything they can to hide the real statistics on addiction, overdoses, and homelessness, which are disproportionately affecting the white population at much greater percentages than anybody else. Drugs and violence in Florida are so bad that a rural county Citrus County, just north of Tampa, has a drug overdose death rate more than 8 times higher than Miami-Dade County. Rural counties in north central Florida have murder rates higher than the city of Chicago. But you wouldn't know that because you were listening to Jason Aldean. Yet most of the news outlets and information centers that target white populations, like rural radio, are doing the complete opposite and telling white people, hey, you guys are the ones that are doing things the right way. Kind of spreading messages or ideologies that nobody gives a crap. I mean, if you go to the beach to enjoy being on the beach on a weekend, the last thing you want to hear is somebody with a microphone screaming profanities at people. The vast majority of us just want to go to the beach, enjoy our weekend, enjoy our life, yet we're finding increasingly in Florida that people are going out of their way to disturb people that are just trying to have a good time. And it's really pathetic. Most people, regardless of their race, just want to go to the beach and enjoy a nice sunset, not listening to somebody on a speakerphone blabbing their stupid ideologies. I always stay on top of news articles coming out of Southwest Florida, and it's been shocking to me over the last few months how so many white murders have come out of Southwest Florida, some even reaching national attention. In a lot of these most infamous cases, what you're hearing on the internet and getting from news sources is far from what actually took place. A lot of times when a black person is the perpetrator of a homicide, they put the face of the person on blast for the cover photo of their news articles. But I've noticed that a lot of these cases coming out of Southwest Florida, instead of using the person's face like they usually do for the mugshot, well, they're hiding the perpetrator's face and using a generic photo. The local news outlets are doing their part to cover up that these perpetrators coming out now in homicides in Southwest Florida are predominantly white. Jacksonville, Florida is part of the Deep South, and the situation in Jacksonville mixes elements of the Deep South with elements of South Florida. And I know that's a little confusing. In the southern region of Florida, you have hate, but in northern Florida, you have segregationists. In the case of the Jacksonville situation, the aggressor was actually antagonistic towards the blacks because the blacks are antagonistic against him. If you look at the dollar store where this situation happened, you'll see that in the review section, white customers have said that when they go to that store, they feel like they're treated badly, which is what happens in places like Birmingham or Montgomery, where if you're white going to a black area, you get treated bad. And if a black person goes into a white area, the same thing will happen. So really, when you get to North Florida, you are forced to pick sides. So you have to understand that Florida has different regions with different types of racism. And today, these hate groups are usually going to be aligned with a political party. Many blacks and Hispanics think that if they put their children in suburban schools, they'll be able to beat their odds and get their family out of inner city neighborhoods that have more crime and that the schools are underfunded. But what they don't know is that when they put their children in these nice suburban schools, their children actually become targets. They don't want black or Hispanic children in those schools. That it's not about inner city or rural or suburban. It's the simple fact that the system as a whole, regardless of its political affiliations, whether it's a large city or a small town or a suburban area, wants to socially, economically marginalize these minorities to where even if you obtain a better house, obtain a better neighborhood, you're still going to be prevented from obtaining the same rights that you deserve. And in areas of South Central Florida, where addiction has taken over counties like Brevard, Martin, Indian River, you're starting to even see blacks make more income than whites. So you have to understand that now in Florida, a large portion of the white population is actually becoming marginalized. However, the difference is that when this white population becomes marginalized, when they're the one being persecuted, when they're the ones being marginalized, they have much more violent tendencies. This newly acquired power of acquisition among the Hispanic community of Florida has made them the target of poor whites who are socially disadvantaged as well. And you're starting to see sentiment, people saying things that are completely unfounded along the lines of illegal immigrants get everything. They gave them everything for free. The truth is, illegal immigrants don't even get a driver's license. It's the stupidest thing you could possibly say. Driver's licenses are denied to these immigrants through their work ethic and not becoming addicted to drugs, and the fact that they're driven to obtain money because they understand they have a limited amount of time to do so. They've actually become more proficient despite their language barriers, despite the disenfranchising, and despite institutionalized racism in the cities that they have to live in. The rising cost of living and inflation means that somebody who lands on the ground, starts working, starts saving money, doesn't spend any money, doesn't have any vices, could very quickly be better off than somebody who, despite being born in the United States, has absolutely no ambition. It's like the rabbit who thought he was going to win the race and didn't take it serious. For a long time, Americans thought that they could just sit back and be on top of the game and not have to worry. But inflation and the cost of living rising means that only individuals who are producing new income at the new inflated rate are the ones that are going to stay on top. Anybody else is getting far behind. You might have had a nice house in the 1980s. Well, that house in the 1980s might have been a palace in 1980, but in 2023, it's now in a bad neighborhood and it's worth absolutely nothing. So people who built out in the suburbs now, they now have the equity and your neighborhood is depreciating. That's how the United States capitalistic system works. It forces people to be enslaved to stay on top of the game. The moment you retire, sit back and get comfortable, everything you have gets swallowed up around you. Then they start to listen to garbage like Dave Ramsey, who's telling people that they should drive a cheap car and save money, not knowing that that money you're saving is nothing. I can make in a month now what takes you a year to save. And it's also this lack of adjusting with the times, falling behind, that's made a lot of Americans who thought they were on top of their game many years ago realize that they are far behind the race now. So a lot of Americans have become extremely bitter because they thought they were on top, they thought they were the supreme race, and they thought everybody else was going to serve them. And now they're finding themselves addicted, many times homeless, and the people who they thought were less than them are now the ones that own the land they're sleeping on illegally. It's definitely ironic that the vast majority of these developers and people who are clearing these lands of homeless camps just happen to be Chinese investors. And many of the people that I encounter in these homeless camps tell me that they had houses and properties, and eventually their drug addiction made them lose everything, and now they're homeless. And you have another generation that bought cars, TV, furniture, credit cards, got themselves in debt, got themselves renting expensive apartments, and now they realize, oh, I'm elderly, I can't make as much money anymore, and my rent's going up, I no longer make enough. That group is quickly heading into homelessness as well. Rural white counties like Citrus are now having drug overdose death rates that are higher than the murder rates in Detroit, which means that secretly what's happening in Florida's white communities is so destructive that it's even worse than what's happening in the worst inner cities of the United States. It's just whites in general are now more propense to commit murders than ever before in Florida. The last murder out of Lee County, Florida, in St. James City, was a white male. In Bradenton, Manatee County, the last person arrested for murder was an 18-year-old white male. And these murders are happening in poor communities, which means that now poor whites are once again becoming the stereotypical alienated persona that the African American male used to be in this country. 15-20 years ago in the state of Florida, it was Hispanics and blacks who were having their rights violated. In the state of Florida now, the biggest violation of civil rights is happening to the homeless population. A homeless population which is disproportionately white, despite what analytics are trying to tell you. And now there's a misinformation campaign telling Hispanics and blacks that California and New York are worse. Well, unfortunately, the drug overdose death rate in Florida is 1.4 times higher than the state of California. The murder rate in Florida continues to be, like always, higher than California. The more something becomes evidently clear, the more they stick to the story that it's a lie. And in that, many people are being misled and misinformed. Taxes are going up for individual people like me and you, but corporate businesses are getting tax breaks. Now they make people go on culture wars against things like Disney. At the same time, secretly, they also been giving Disney some of the biggest tax cuts they've ever had. They're making people fight these culture wars despite the fact that the real analytics are no longer on their side. You're being clowned. You're being played. Take the song from Jason Aldean, In a Small Town. Analytically today, big cities have lower murder rates, more safety. Basically, the entire song is a lie. But people believe the narrative because 15, 20 years ago, that may have been true. In most of the United States right now, it's the larger cities that have the lowest murder rate. But that is what happens today in the United States, where people don't look at real numbers, don't look at analytics. They just simply let their political affiliations determine where they're going to live, determine what music they're going to listen to. This is how stupid people in the United States have become. People in the United States will drive a pickup truck even though they really need a Prius because that is what their political affiliation tells them to do, and vice versa. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I've seen in California people trying to tow a trailer with a tiny little vehicle. They need an F-350 at that point. But that's the ironic thing, is that people just believe what they're told to believe by their politicians, and they buy the products, the vehicles, whatever their politicians tell them they need to do, that's what they do. When I was hauling a trailer, I used to have a GMC 2500. All my redneck neighbors in Fort Myers loved me because I had a 2500. But I had it because I was hauling a trailer, you moron. Now I have a Toyota Camry. Oh, that makes me a liberal. No, you idiot. I drive long distances traveling for a living now. It makes more sense to do that in a Camry than it does in a 2500. But see, that's the stupidity of people today in the United States, where the shoes you buy, the car you drive, and even the freaking food you eat at this point is determined by your political affiliation. And when you look at racism in Florida, basically you're just having masses of people being manipulated to think that somebody else is the antagonistic party. I've heard white Americans complaining that Hispanics are taking their jobs. I'm a Hispanic. I don't want to go cut grass. I don't want to go climb on a roof. I want to work in front of a computer in the air conditioner. So how stupid do you have to be, born in the United States with the American language, to want the job that an illegal is doing? How stupid do you have to be to aim that freaking low? And that is the problem with racism in Florida. It's that poor whites are becoming complacent because they're not having it as easy as they used to. And hey, don't have any hard feelings against me for telling you this. You should be thanking me for putting you on the game. So if you're a white person and you're poor and you're going through this situation right now, you don't need to be mad at me for telling you this. You need to be thanking me for putting you on game that other people aren't putting you onto. When I lived in Alabama, my business was called Jose's Junk Removal. I made it a point that when people found my business on Google Maps, that they knew before they called me that I was Hispanic. Why? Why would I do that? If Alabama is so racist, why would I let everybody from the start know that I was Hispanic? Because we have a reputation of having a strong work ethic. Even people who are racist are going to call Jose or Juan if they need a roof or a landscaping job, not Billy. You buy a Hyundai now, made in Montgomery, Alabama, and it's a piece of crap, and you're like, well, these Koreans don't know how to make a car. No, the Koreans did know how to make a car, but Billy from Montgomery, Alabama doesn't like Koreans, and he works for them for $15 an hour, and he feels that despite the fact he dropped out of high school, he should make more money than a Korean engineer who studied his entire life to be a freaking engineer. Guys, we could go forever on this topic of racism in Florida, but the reason that racism in Florida is increasing is simply because the white population is being marginalized by their political parties. However, those same political parties are saying, hey, look at the Hispanics, look at the blacks, they're the ones that are making life impossible for you. No, it's not. The same people that are hurting you are the same ones that are telling you that it's somebody else hurting you. You should go after those people. And you believe it blindly. Let me tell you, South Florida is different than all these other places. And most of the racist people in Florida, South Florida, are not from here. I got friends that lived in Florida their whole entire lives. South Florida, poor whites who grew up in Hispanic neighborhoods that have lived their entire lives around Hispanic communities, being helped by those people, being family to those people. All of a sudden, here comes somebody else from that same state. They move to Florida and they start to spill this hate all over the state. But the real poor whites that are from Florida grew up in the same communities and we're all the same. A lot of those people bought into what they were hearing, and now they moved to other places and they're finding real racism. Some old rich guy from up north comes to Florida to retire. He dies. His children came with him, but they came to Florida to retire in beaches. Hey, they didn't come to Florida to have to deal with your broke personality. They don't want to know about you. They came to Florida to retire. They don't want to go to a family dinner. They want to go to the beach and play golf with other people like them. Eventually, those elderly people that move to Florida and retire pass away. When they pass away, then their children, who never amounted to anything because they knew they had an inheritance coming, get those houses and those properties. They might live in it for 2 or 3 years, but eventually when the money runs out, they sell it and they buy a mobile home that's cheaper. When they've spent those $200 or $300 on drugs and stupid decisions and cigarettes, then they become homeless on the money that they had from their mobile home. When that money runs out, then there's nothing left. This has been systematically happening in Florida now for 15 to 20 years. Parents move to Florida with an adolescent kid. Hey, they moved to Florida because they're getting ready to retire. When you turn 18, they want nothing to do with you. They didn't come here to Florida for you. They came here for Florida for them. They eventually pass away. Those kids, in the meantime, don't do anything with their lives because they're waiting for a freaking inheritance. And you believe that the first thing those people are going to do when they get their inheritance is smoke it away, legally or illegally. And what's scary about Florida is that this demographic of elderly, wealthy person moving to Florida continues to set the trends. That's why Spring Hill, Newport Richey, these were the places that people were moving to Florida many years ago. Now are the most drug addict and rampant drug addiction places in the entire state. Newport Richey, Brevard, these were the places where people used to retire in Florida. But those retired people passed away. Their kids inherited those properties, and those were people that never amounted to anything. And why didn't they ever amount to anything? Because they were holding on to their inheritance, their white privilege, and they thought that that was the only thing they needed for their lives. Turns out, it takes an education and making a lot of income to continue in this ever-increasing world of inflation. So do you guys understand how systematically Florida is set up so that the people that retire get the best deal right now? But what they leave behind, it's not natural. It's not a natural thing. Why doesn't Florida function? It's not natural for Florida or anywhere in the world to be a place where people go to die. That's not the way places work. People move to places to have children and have lives, not to freaking die. This is a place where people come here with the intention of dying, and then there's other people like vultures behind them waiting for those people to die so they can take their fangs. It's not a system that's meant to work. They know that this is a quick flip state. People don't move somewhere and in 5 or 6 years sell those houses. People, when they move somewhere, they settle down and they live their lives, and they live in the towns where their grandparents live. This whole thing in Florida of how transient it is, the rich are now becoming victims of the mega rich. The state of Florida purposely makes sure that schools are bad, that they make laws that make Hispanics and young people leave, that prices become unbearable for the youth because the youth is more inclined to not go with the system that they have in place. So systematically, the state of Florida is trying to get rid of the people that they think aren't going to support their long-standing. So when you think about racism, you might think about a place like Alabama, where the whites hold all the power and they don't give anything to the black people. Or cities like Birmingham or Jacksonville, Florida, where if the blacks control a sector of the economy, they don't want to share it with anybody else. In the state of Alabama, the whites know that they together work in conjunction against other races. But the poor whites of Florida, they know that the government's not giving them any crap. Their own white people aren't doing crap for them. Whites in Alabama have been able to keep blacks at bay economically. Unfortunately for them in the state of Florida, they can't keep Hispanics from being wealthier. They know they have to have that vote. So they make a political alliance, but it stops there. It doesn't go beyond that. They're not putting anything American there. Okay, so there's no investment in those communities. Everything is mom and pop places. But see, this is where, again, racism backfires, because they've excluded American investments in the city of Miami. Now you have a bunch of small businesses that are making the money that would have been made by Walmart. It's a beast they can't control. There's so many factors that they can't institutionalize the way they want to. They can't control and manipulate it because there's so many players involved that are exterior. Look at the city of Lehigh Acres. They're at the point where they're saying, hey, we want to make Lehigh Acres a city. They haven't incorporated Lehigh Acres. The day that they are able to incorporate Lehigh Acres, it's going to be 70 or 80% Hispanic people, and they're going to go on to turn Lehigh Acres into Hialeah, which means it's going to become a very wealthy and powerful city. Their crime rates are going to be controlled, because let me tell you something, if there's one thing Cubans have done in Hialeah is lower their murder rates, lower their crime rates, and make sure that everybody can have a decent standard of living. And it's made real estate values very expensive. Very similar to what Asians have done in San Francisco, city with the highest incomes in the United States, if you didn't know. Most of the time, however, these types of acts are done institutionally, and when an individual takes on the role of playing a violent perpetrator, that's not even the way racism really works. That's an individual who doesn't understand the rules, because most real racist and powerful people that are white are just going to pin blacks against each other. The casualties will be much higher and the responsibility will be on them. Like real institutionalized racism puts you against your own people. So this weird act, and the thing that happened in Montgomery too, shows that racist people no longer have institutional control like they used to. And that's why they're resorting to violence, because they lost the ability to institutionally carry out racism. You burn down bridges when you're retreating. When you're advancing, you're not worried about that. These types of violent acts come from a cornered nature. Things are only going to get worse. A lot of Hispanics are just moving back to their native countries because they're tired of it. A lot of Asians are doing the same. Everybody's just retreating back into their own communities and neighborhoods, because they understand that, the way the United States is moving, It's just going to become worse and worse for everybody, not just for one particular group. Whites have always hurt other races, but they've done it institutionally, they've done it craftily, and very well planned and organized and orchestrated. So when you see these random acts of violence from whites, it just simply means that they understand that they don't have that power that they did before. They don't have the ability to just marginalize other people and exploit them like they have in the past. And that's why you're seeing these types of acts. And the more power they lose, the more violent they're going to get. You can't enslave black people. You can't pay Hispanics less. And you can't keep exploiting other people. You're going to have to take care of yourself and actually work for yourself. The more they realize that, the more violent and dangerous they're going to become. White people that are affluent in Florida aren't even afraid of Hispanics and blacks anymore. Dude, they're afraid of homeless people, which are predominantly white. It's a changing world. They're afraid of going to a small town because of the good old boy systems. It's a different atmosphere. Americans are starting to move to Mexico because they're afraid of the United States. It's a different time that we're in, and fear is a huge factor in all of these stupid decisions that people are making.